Hi, my name is Hannah Brenlan, and I teach 5th grade in South King County. So I'm with a lot more like grown-ups and grown-up ideas right now. A couple more big words. I'm finishing my master's in education right now, and I'm researching the development of suburban white educators' racial literacy. In the last 15 years, my district has jumped from 25% students of color to 60%. And as urban cores gentrify across the country, communities of color are pushed into the suburbs. And while student racial demographics are changing very rapidly, educators' demographics are not. In my own district, 90% of our teachers are white, and I am one of them. In her book, So You Want to Talk About Race? Ijeoma Oluo says that the topic of race is more exhausting for some people than it is for others. And so, as Johanna mentioned earlier, I really invite you to please take care of yourself, however you need to in this conversation. I'm white. I'm talking about race. This can be uncomfortable. And I know that I need to be having these conversations with other white teachers. I chose to research racial literacy because it's a term that I think really resonates with educators. We teach kids how to look closely at words, how to self-correct when we read, and to reflect on our own knowledge and experience when understanding complex texts. So what is racial literacy? Lani Guinier first defined the term as the capacity to decipher the racial grammar that frames the narratives of our republic. So the racial grammar, I think that's a really interesting phrase, can be found throughout our country's history. It's in our constitution, our economy, our courts, and our education system. And in the same year, France Windance Twine defined racial literacy much more intimately. She was observing white parents raising children of color in the UK. And these white adults were having really hard conversations with their own kids. How does a white parent react when their child says that she wishes she had lighter skin? And what about when their child comes home asking about racial slurs that they heard at school? So I looked through these two different lenses of racial literacy. Guinier's take on systemic racial oppression and Twine's strategies to disrupt everyday racism, and I combined them to define racial literacy in schools as the ability to navigate conversations about race and understand how race impacts ourselves and our students inside and outside of the classroom. So white educators are often considered color mute, as Micah Pollock calls it, because of our own anxiety. When race comes up amongst students, I've heard teachers say things like, "We don't talk about that here. That's a conversation for home." And the reality is that we are always talking about race, whether we are referring to low students or supporting all students. White teachers are often indicating race without actually naming it. And so in my research, the best practice that I found so far for developing racial literacy is reflection. And this can include individual journaling or conversations with colleagues, mostly so that adults can practice talking about race with each other before they're expected to facilitate those conversations in their own classrooms. So I grew up in Anacortes, Washington, which is north of here, and I used to describe this as a small town that was entirely white. It wasn't. And I was recently talking a few years ago with a childhood friend after we had both graduated from college, and he's mixed race, he often passes as white, and he was telling me these stories about growing up in Anacortes that were very different than my stories. And he spoke of unknowing and really hurtful comments from peers and teachers that clearly impacted his sense of self and his school experience. And I told my friend, "Thank you so much for sharing these stories. I'm so glad that we're finally able to talk about these now." And a year after that conversation, my friend later said to me, "Hannah, those stories that you're glad that I finally told you, I told you those stories as they were happening when we were kids, and you couldn't hear them." And so I think to myself, what stories are my students, my 10-year-olds, telling me today that I still can't hear? And if racial literacy in schools is about race impacting people inside and outside of a classroom, what is your classroom? Is it your office? Is it the work site, your gym, your church, your Facebook feed, your family gatherings? How does race impact people inside and outside of those spaces? And like I tell my students, no one is perfectly literate. Everyone makes mistakes when we read, and we are all coming across the words that we don't know yet. And Lonnie Gunier wrote, the original person who defined racial literacy, she says that racial literacy is about learning rather than knowing. It's about learning rather than knowing. So what are the stories that you are still learning to hear?